Good morning, Jamie. How are you?
Thanks. Very good. Well, thank you so much for making the time to join this Sentientist conversation. I first came across your work when you gave a talk at one of the animal law forums recently, which I found absolutely fascinating. So it's great to have you here to sort of talk us through your own personal philosophical journey and agenda for the future. So in these conversations, we're really centering them around, I guess, the two deepest philosophical questions: what's real and what matters. And I'm trying to develop this, I guess, recasting of the term sentientism as a very simple pluralistic philosophy that commits to using evidence and reason, so a naturalistic basis for epistemology, and then a sentiocentric approach to morality that says we should at least grant moral consideration to all sentient beings. So that's the frame for the conversation. But I'm talking to people who agree with that worldview, but also people who disagree with it as well. So we'll see, how the conversation evolves. But it's centered around those two central philosophical questions. But before we start, it'd be great for people who don't know your work if you could just briefly introduce yourself and your focus.
Well, thank you so much, Jamie. It's a real pleasure to be on your program. I've really enjoyed the previous episodes you've had. Very impressive people, and it's an honor to be a part of that conversation.
Thanks.
I'm a career environmental law professor, so primarily a career academic as well. So I have a 30-plus year career in environmental law, and 26 of those years were spent in academia. And if you divide the academic career, it was almost exclusively law school environmental law academia.
Yeah.
It's only been the past 3 years that I made an unusual transition in the mind of many of my colleagues in legal academia to teach law to undergraduates. I joined Monmouth University in New Jersey in 2018, and so this is my third year teaching law to undergraduates. And so I've taught very much the same course package. Given that environmental law has always been my focus, I taught it to law students, and then I transitioned to teach that to undergraduate students. And so when I say environmental law, it's both domestic and international. And so the last decade or so of my career, my environmental law focus has been very much focused on climate change law and justice. I still do teach U.S. environmental law as well, but the climate change focus has really taken center stage in my teaching and scholarship in the past 15 years, I would say. And then in the past 7 years, 2013 was when I first transitioned into animal law. And that really revolutionized my thinking and teaching and writing on a lot of the issues that I confront as a teacher and a scholar. And so I taught my animal law course for the first time in 2014 at Florida A&M Law School, and I've taught it several times at several institutions since then, and currently teach it at Monmouth to undergrads. I also have more than a decade of teaching constitutional law, so that's also relevant for our discussion today. So I'll get into this more later, but I've always had kind of a philosophical lens prior to my higher education and throughout my career. And so the mix of constitutional law and animal law and climate justice all involves this kind of moral lens on a lot of the things that law and policy ought to be doing.
Yeah, fascinating. And I think those themes will run through much of our conversation. And your perspective, I think, is fascinating, partly because you come with that philosophical background, but also because you've worked across all those different silos of legal thinking as well. And I think they have much to learn from each other. So, as an amateur standing outside it. So. Yeah.
And silos is a good term because that's one of the major reasons that prompted me to make that transition from law school academia to undergraduate academia, was that I felt somewhat trapped in that law school silo. It was always surrounded by law professors and law students. And then when I want to branch outside that box, it was more of a challenge. Whereas on an undergraduate campus, I'm surrounded by, walking in one direction or the other, scholars of many disciplines that welcome that interdisciplinary conversation. And I find that I'm very much a free agent in conveying ideas across campus, and many undergraduate departments are very much in their own silos, much like law school, because that's just the way academic disciplines work. And I'm glad to be outside those lines. I feel like I can be much more engaged as a thinker and a teacher and scholar.
Yeah, and I think those academic silos are often reflected in the activist and advocacy worlds as well, and as they are in the corporate world, as they are in fields of government policy as well. And you'll see environmental activists and thinkers who haven't got their heads around the animal advocacy angles, and you've got people in the animal advocacy movement who haven't quite grasped challenges in both, human ethics and rights, but also in the environmental angle. So, fascinating perspective.
That's one thing that I was struck by when I made that transition, bringing environmental law background into animal law. I was aware of divides within the environmental movement, for instance, between pollution control and natural resources protection. But in the animal law movement, they're even more stark, the divide between animal rights versus animal welfare. And then what struck me even more was how, even though they ought to be more closely aligned, environmental law and animal law don't cooperate nearly as much as they should. And that inspired one of my recent book projects.
Absolutely. So it would be good to, before we come back to drill into some of that stuff and its implications for the future, to wind the clock back and go back to your personal philosophical journey, I guess, and around those two central questions. And the first one I'd like to start with is this question of what's real. So for many people, that's a story about whether they grew up in a naturalistic or an atheistic household, or a household with a religious or a supernatural worldview, and whether that way of thinking about what's real in the world has shifted over time.
Yeah, so my background was a bit of a hybrid that way. It was a Catholic household, although not a strictly practicing Catholic household. So I had some relatives who were close to me, particularly an aunt who was a very strict practicing Catholic, my mother's sister. And it was really her influence that kind of kept me connected to the Catholic upbringing, although again, not in a very strict way, because my parents were not strict practicing Catholic. So what it meant for my upbringing was that I was exposed to organized religion in kind of a more removed kind of way. I attended church not every week. It was more of a social and cultural thing rather than a spiritual thing.
Yeah.
I went through the Catholic stages of sacraments up through communion. And again, it was really more to fulfill expectations of others in my outside my immediate family who expected that of those who were growing up with our family name. And so by the time that I had gone on to college, it was very much not a part of my life. So I was always more of a philosophical thinker as a child, and not surprisingly, I gravitated toward philosophy as a major in my undergraduate studies. And I think when I found philosophy as a field of study, I grew this enhanced appreciation for religion and what it represents started to develop, not as something I wanted to practice, but something that I wanted to study. I was really drawn to the way religion represents, organized religion represents a lot of different worldviews about what matters, how do we make sense of the human condition? And so I was very interested in that as a student of philosophy, to study different religions. So I did take courses in Eastern philosophy and religion, and it really did kind of inform my thinking as a philosophy student. So I was always very interested in spirituality from that perspective, not something to practice and join a team, but I was always a very independent thinker about the role of spirituality in my kind of worldview and who I am. And so I always tell people that one of the most spiritual people you'll meet, and yet I don't practice a religion, and they have a hard time with that, but it's true. I mean, I really feel a connection beyond just thinking to my place in the world, and that's not just rationality. There's more to that. And so and my son had an even looser kind of way of entering the world and figuring out religion. He didn't have any truly agnostic household. And then after he thought through it all and majored in philosophy, he went on to be a practicing Buddhist. And so I think in some ways I have a lot of respect for those Eastern religions as a way of thinking about things, but I never felt the interest in practicing, whereas I fully respect his interest in doing it for his needs.
Yeah, I mean, there's such a fascinating richness and diversity of thought and ethics that flow through all of those religions, and there are distinct differences, but there are also some really common themes that run through them too, and there's enormous value in those. And particularly given my interests, and I guess the stance of sentientism, which really is focused on a universal broad compassion, you can see that in many religions, and particularly in religions like Buddhism and Jainism and Rastafarianism. There's already a a moral circle there that goes well beyond the human. So there's enormous value to pick up from all of those. So it's interesting. It sounds like your interest in those in religions was an intellectual one and one of sort of studying the variety and richness of human thought. And you do have that sort of what you call a spiritual identification with the universe and a sense of connectedness and sense of wonder, but you don't subscribe to any of those sort of supernatural systems or necessarily the sort of lists of beliefs or tenets that you'd find within.
Right. And I don't dismiss them either, though. So one thing I should clarify is that my wife is an atheist, and I reject the atheist view of there just is not spiritual force out there. So we have interesting conversations about that, and I'm to the core agnostic in that way. I remain open to spiritual values without joining any of those teams.
Yeah, it makes sense. And a number of the conversations I've had, people have gone along a similar line. They say, look, I don't hold to a supernatural belief, but I remain open to, even quite radical ideas. And we need a sort of, even as a naturalist, you need that level of humility that is, radically open-minded. I think the difference is that you as an agnostic or even as an atheist, which I take a slightly different definition of atheism as just the absence of a belief in a God, not necessarily being confident there isn't one. But as you say, many atheists take it that next step and say, no, I'm so confident there isn't that, they're more comfortable putting that in a positive framing. But I think that radical open-mindedness and that humility is an essential hallmark of a sensible naturalistic approach as well. Yes. And I think there's a lot of common ground between people with different sets of religious and supernatural views, with many people who have, my naturalism is actually fairly sort of hard-edged, physicalist, materialist perspective. But even in that context, that doesn't mean I have a sort of cold, emotionless, spreadsheet-based understanding of the world. I feel a very visceral sense of awe and wonder and connectedness, and ultimately we are all connected and we are all stardust. That I think emotionally for me probably feels very similar to how people who might call themselves spiritual or religious have a similar sort of sense. I think there's much more common ground there than we might think. So.
Yeah, and I'm glad you made that distinction about types of atheism, because my wife came up through the former Soviet Union brand of atheism. Religion is the opiate of the masses. So it was very much of this affirmative rejection of organized spirituality.
Yeah, and I think for me, the compassion that I try and have through Sentientism includes a compassion for people with supernatural and religious beliefs, of course. So I think that leads you to not wanting to prevent people from believing what they want. It leads you to, belief in freedom of belief and a freedom of conscience and a freedom of thought and a freedom of speech that I think needs to be much more open-minded than, the tone you might pick up from some atheists who, sometimes feel like they, want to impose a particular view. But so my challenge to religious and supernatural modes of thoughts really brings us on to the next topic, which is where those supernatural beliefs have a warping or a negative effect on our ethical systems. So I guess I'd have a robust support for freedom of belief, but I will reject any use of supernatural beliefs in justifying causing needless harm or suffering to others. And so if you can find a supernatural or religious school of thought that strips out some of the problems we find in organized religion, whether it's sexism or racism or caste discrimination or apostasy or blasphemy or freedom constraints, if you can strip all of that stuff out and end up with a broad, compassionate ethic, people can believe what they like, as far as I'm concerned. So,
yeah, very much the same.
Yeah, and it sounds like that sort of religious background was one of community and identification more than it was one of sort of moral grounding or ethics. And it sounds like it sort of faded to the background rather than being something you explicitly rejected or felt any difficulty in going through the process of moving away from that. Whereas some people I've spoken to have had a much more difficult experience of leaving a religion or a religious community, because it depends on the nature of that community, how comfortable they are with people abandoning the supernatural beliefs. But one of the reasons why some people are hesitant about moving away from a religious mode of thought is because they're nervous about what it will do to their morality. They're worried that they'll lose some sort of moral foundation. They don't have the commandments or the list of rules to follow. They don't have some sort of perfect ethical judge to to cast judgment on our behavior, and they're worried they'll lose some sort of objective form of ethics. So in the absence of that sort of supernaturally grounded ethics, how would you describe the foundation of your moral system? Is it something you can explain simply? And again, how's that shifted over time?
I would say it was always grounded in compassion and reason. I think both are very prominent in my worldview. The biggest irony in that, though, that was a tension that wasn't really attention until I realized it, was when I started to teach animal law, and I realized that I had this compassion for all living things and a great respect for nature, and yet it didn't occur to me that eating factory farmed meat was a conflict with those values until I started to teach animal law. And then it was just such a stark moral failure on my part that how could I have not known or seen that, even as an environmental law professor, that my food choices are probably the most impactful outcome of my individual life on the planet and on animals. And how can I say that I respect the planet and animals if I'm making those decisions to exploit through those individual food choices?
And that sounds like quite a sort of light bulb moment, but was it that a difficult process to work through? Or,
not at all. It was more of a sense of, how could I have been morally asleep for so long, as someone who does really apply compassion and reason to everything that I did in my career and in my life? How was that this glaring gap that persisted so long? And I think as I began to study and teach about animal law, it is because of the brainwashing we're exposed to in society about, protein comes from animals and essential nutrient in your diet, and vegetarians are and vegans are frail and weak, and ultimately you're choosing this radical counterculture way to live if you go that way. I mean, I didn't know a single vegetarian or vegan in my entire circle.
Wow.
Colleagues, friends, family, nobody. And so it just didn't occur to me that was something that might not be a bad way to proceed.
And was the social side of that transition difficult for you as well? How did people around you react?
Enormously difficult. It's still a process. Yeah, it's just something that has not been embraced by many family members, friends. They just don't see it as something that they would ever choose to do. They don't understand why it's something that makes sense for me, and it's at best tolerated. And so I have a much larger network now of colleagues and friends who are vegetarian and vegan. My son's a vegan, my wife's vegetarian like I am. And the more we are in that world, we're seeing it grow exponentially, which is very encouraging. There's just a lot more information out there now than there was when I was growing up and in my early career. Now it's available for everyone to make a more conscious choice than was true 10, 20 years ago.
Yeah, and I've gone through a similar journey, and I think it took me longer. But it's sobering. We like to kid ourselves that we're quite, rational and reasonable thinkers, and that we do base our ethics on some sort of reasoning process. But those social norms hold us so tightly that even, I would argue the argument about the ethics of animal farming is essentially over. I mean, the argument is so clear and so direct, both in terms of its impact on human animals, but certainly of its direct impact on non-human animals, let alone the environment and so on. The rationale and the reasoning, I might be biased here, just seems incontrovertible and clear. And most of the conversations you have aren't really around the central moral reasoning either. They're sort of desperate mental gymnastics for people trying to justify the way they continue to act. But those social norms hold us so strongly because essentially nearly everyone from birth is taught that this is completely normal. And even now, as you say, I think things are shifting. It feels like, maybe veganism is about where vegetarianism was 10 years ago, and vegetarianism was, again, moved on in terms of how normal it feels and how acceptable it feels. But those constraints are still remarkably strong even now. And that's a difficult thing, because I think we also like to think that just as we're ethically reasonable people, that we can also persuade others just through sheer ethical argument as well. And I think the reality is that while that does work with some people, where the light bulb goes on and they've thought something through and they're willing to make a change, that's way too rare and too slow to drive the sort of change that I think we need. And that does lead you on to, needing to pull some other levers too. One other interesting thing about the sort of sentiocentric view, if you like, or one that includes, simply speaking, non-human animals in our sphere of moral consideration. One obvious criticism is that we've gone too far and that we need to focus more strongly on humans, and that, whether for religious reasons of thinking of us being made in the image of a god, or us being given dominion over others, or just a traditional naturalistic view which says, we're humans, we are the superior species, we're the apex of some imagined tree of life, and we have the right to farm animals and harm animals as we see fit because we're the most important. That sort of anthropocentric view. So that's one classical challenge. And sentientism and sentiocentrism resist that by saying, but other suffering matters as well. And it's very clear that it's not just humans that are capable of suffering. But there's another criticism of sentientism and sentiocentrism is that it doesn't go far enough, because sentientism, while it doesn't have a list of beings or species or entities that qualify as sentient, it just says, look, let's follow the science with humility and uncertainty and prudence. But most, including myself, most sentientists would say, well, it seems like the scientific consensus at the moment is that humans are certainly sentient. The vast majority of non-human animals are sentient. There might be some very, very simple animals, maybe sea cucumbers or right at the most simple types of invertebrates who arguably are on the borderline or aren't sentient. But the plants, rocks, rivers, trees, other biological and ecosystem entities aren't sentient. They don't have the capability to suffer. So while a sentientist would say, those things are all deeply important because of the rich web of interdependencies that sentient beings have, they're not intrinsically important in their own right. And whereas a biocentrist or an ecocentrist would resist that and say, in a way, your sentiocentrism is another form of discrimination, and we need a broader moral circle that grants direct moral and intrinsic moral consideration to plants and other biological systems, and even to the wider ecosystem as well. And given your focus, I'd be fascinated to know, whether you draw lines, how you draw lines, and how do you think about wider bio or ecocentric perspectives in contrast with a sentientist perspective.
Yeah, I'd wrestle with that. I embrace both. And so I agree that sentientism doesn't go far enough, in that it needs to embrace the non-sentient entities in the world. So my climate change and Voiceless book has those three categories of voiceless that need protection, that aren't adequately represented under the law. And those would be children and unborn humans, wildlife, and natural resources. So all three share this common foundation of inadequate protection under the law, and they need us as adult humans to, and you use that word dominion, and I focus on that in my teaching. When a lot of Christians focus on dominion in the Bible, and they use that as a justification for man being superior, humans being superior to control nature for their own needs. Another and equally plausible view of that, and even Pope Francis espouses it, is that dominion really is about stewardship. That we have a responsibility to care for those within the domain of the human's universe, and protect those that can't protect themselves, as part of our moral responsibility as being positioned as we are, as thinking actors, and in a position to look out for those that can't represent themselves. So rocks can't look out for raccoons, but as adult humans, we can look out for all of these entities that lack their own independent source of legal protection to avoid exploitation. Yeah,
and I've heard some people even criticize that stewardship way of thinking, because they're saying even that is anthropocentric. It's still putting humans at the center, and I can appreciate that, because I think part of the intent behind sentientism is it's trying to break that anthropocentrism and say, look, sentience existed long before humans came on the scene. It certainly exists, way wider and at much greater scale than in the human species as well. So I do appreciate that challenge, but at the same time, we do have distinctive capabilities that no other species has, and with that, comes responsibilities. So, I think I'm not a fan of the schools of thought which are so nervous about anthropocentrism that they think humans should just withdraw from having any responsibility for the wider world and sort of let nature take its course, because there is much suffering in nature and much damage in nature too.
And that's a great point. And that's why in my book, I really have a bifurcated approach to advancing this idea. Stewardship is just one piece of it. So
Yeah.
sometimes based on the constraints of the legal system, stewardship may be the best we can do for non-humans. But ideally, and what I advocate in the book, is that we also need rights-based protections. So basically conferring legal rights to animals and to natural resources. We're seeing developments in both spheres all over the world now. Rivers have been granted legal personhood.
Yeah.
Animals are being granted the right to be free from free from abuse, free from confinement. So we've got those developments happening already. So that tends to make the status quo folks a bit more nervous, this idea of rights-based protection. So I see kind of a continuum of getting to the stewardship model first so that we can at least do a better job protecting those voiceless entities under the law. But ideally, a rights-based system is really where we need to be to fully recognize their right to be protected.
Yeah, and I think there's enormous common ground there as well, because most sentientists, including me, while I wouldn't grant direct moral consideration to a tree or to a river or to a mountain range, would still absolutely agree that those things need protecting. And whether that's we use rights as a tool or personhood as a tool or various legal protections, I'm completely open-minded about how we do that, because they absolutely need protecting. Because I think there's some ecocentrists or biocentrists might look at sentientism and think that our perspective on the wider environment is just that we want sort of a clinical list of ecosystem services to enable us to continue surviving. And that's very far from the truth. I think most sentientists, and they're a radically diverse group of people, actually share that rich appreciation for the multifarious value of ecosystems, because it's not just about ecosystem services and survival and, and shelter and the other things we might need from the environment. It's the full range of rich aesthetic experiences that we and other sentient beings have in the environment as well. So I think there's enormous common cause there. I think that the point of tension for me is that, in a way, sentientism is quite neutral about whether we grant moral consideration beyond sentient beings. But it's very clear that as we do that, if you do grant direct moral consideration to plants or ecosystems or non-sentient entities, that we don't do that in a way that harms the sentient beings. And that is a challenge I find, and I think you might echo this in much of the environmental and the conservationist movement, where people have gone from a broad concern for humans and humanity as a whole, which is enormously positive, echoing Universal Declaration of Human Rights and having a concern for humans as a whole. And because of the climate change and environmental threats to humans, they've jumped to a very wide ecocentric perspective that, again, is arguably should be a very positive expansion of the moral circle. But in doing so, they've excluded a vast tranche of very sentient beings that are actually capable of experiencing suffering and flourishing and being harmed. So you'll see that in, many environmentalists will act as though they have more of a moral consideration for a tree or a rock or a river or a valley than they do over a farmed animal or a non-charismatic wild animal, for example. So that's where I have the point of tension. I can share that broad, respect for and even reverence for non-sentient environments, and we should protect them richly and powerfully. But I'm very nervous when people's moral circle, instead of being a moral circle, ends up being a sort of multi-layered donut where they've carved out large tranches of sentient suffering animals from that perspective. I find that frustrating.
And I really see it as a win-win in terms of the approach that I take in the book, is that I don't see this broader ecocentric view somehow diminishing the protection for sentient beings. I really see it as protecting both domains within this view of whether you take it from an anthropocentric view or not. If you are conveying that moral consideration for those that are non-human, then certainly it makes sense that it would embrace both animals and natural resources. And even if you do take it from an anthropocentric lens, given climate change and the mutual threats that all of us face, it's in humans' interest to promote the protection of non-humans, because that's going to make our ecosystems more resilient and robust and prevent greater harm to humans from climate change. So we're really in this together, and I don't see it as isolating any one camp. When you take that true ecocentric view, I don't see it as diminishing the sentient animals in this effort to protect the non-sentient natural resources.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, well, I'm not a philosopher myself, but I have an amateur interest in the field. There are so many really difficult, intractable problems, difficult trade-offs or different moral systems. But this one just seems, as you said, a win-win-win. It's so obvious. It's almost whatever perspective you take, whether you're just concerned for humans or you're just concerned about sentient beings or whether you have a wider concern for the environment, the topic of animal farming just seems, sometimes the biggest problems are have the easiest answers, but it's a question of working through those social norms to help us all recognize that and make the change to reflect it.
Yeah, there's no question that our addiction to fossil fuels and our addiction to industrial animal agriculture are perhaps the biggest threats to the planet, and in many ways, from a moral and legal perspective, really the low-hanging fruit to save ourselves fastest. I mean,
Yeah.
we're already understanding that we have to transition to renewables. We just have to get there faster. We already realize the harm on multiple levels to human health, to animals, to the environment from industrial animal agriculture. We know we need to transition to a plant-based system, but we just have to get there faster because climate change is this ticking clock and obtrusively in the background that's not giving us that natural moral and social evolution time frame to get there. It's not going to be like the transition from the agricultural to the industrial domain that we saw a few centuries ago. It's going to be very much a flip of a switch, and that's really the world we're living in. If we want to save ourselves, we have to be at warp speed in these social and cultural and spiritual transformations in how we live.
Yeah, technically, so much of it is actually pretty easy. It's much more of a social challenge than it is a technical challenge, which is hopeful but also frustrating. And I think one of the themes that's flowed through many of these conversations is really a reflection of that, is that actually, as we make the technical changes and as we shift our actions, it will free us up to improve our ethics. I'd love it to work the other way around, but quite often, that's just not the way it is. But I do think there is a sort of latent ethical wellspring in the human species, right? Generally, most people don't like causing suffering. Generally, most people don't want the human race to be threatened by environmental crises, right? So there's this latent well of human ethics ready to be released if we can just, drive the practical changes quickly enough.
It's true, and there's these challenges that we face as humans of our comfort zone and getting us out of that fast enough is really the biggest challenge, especially in America. I mean, at a time when we're trying to transition away from fossil fuels, sales of SUVs are higher than they've ever been, which is just shocking. Everywhere I go in any kind of parking lot, I'm surrounded by SUVs in 2020. I mean, it's just mind blowing. So that sense of I've earned this right to be comfortable regardless of the consequences. Americans drive big cars, they live in big houses, they use vast expanses of land that in unnecessary and exploitative ways. And that kind of undoing all those bad habits very quickly is virtually impossible, but it necessary. And so things like COVID kind of give us that fighting chance to say, okay, 2020 showed us that we can achieve radical changes in our lifestyles and still be okay. It's not going to be pleasant all the time, but we're capable of this, and we know we have to get there. So maybe this is a window into the future that we just have to not go back to normal when we get out of this pandemic. This is the window to the future, and I think that's really given us a fighting chance for envisioning how we might be more sustainable and respectful of non-humans moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, reality is a harsh teacher, and just we just need to learn. So hopefully, as you say, the COVID, what we're going through with COVID will, awful experience for many people, but hopefully we'll take some lessons from it.
Absolutely. And I've been doing a lot of thinking and writing and teaching about that because it's just been amazing how many insights that's generated just in half a year. But the other piece that I was going to mention was the idea of moral blind spots, that all humans have this ability to rationalize in a way that makes them feel secure in their beliefs. And so, I mean, I'm guilty of that as much as anybody. And so, for instance, as an animal law professor and as my son would say, only being vegetarian, that's a moral blind spot for me. I mean, I just haven't been able to make the full commitment to an entirely vegan lifestyle because I'm not quite there yet. I've been transitioning slowly. And likewise with respect for non-humans, I've never had respect for insects. I just don't treat them with respect. I feel threatened by them, things that can bite or sting me, but it's not consistent with my view that non-humans deserve my respect and compassion. So it's just a part of being human.
Yeah, and there is one of the dangerous things I think about some of these fields, and you can see it both in the sort of atheistic skeptic movement and also in the vegan and the animal advocacy movement, is the impression that there's some sort of state of moral or epistemological purity you can achieve, and if you're not at that level, then you failed in some way. And often there's more fighting within those communities about who's the purist than there is challenging the people who've yet to get on the bandwagon. And I think there's something insidious about that because, even, no one's I don't think perfection is achievable. But there's also a problem in that when people recognize that because perfection isn't achievable, that's not an excuse to not keep trying and to keep working on those blind spots. We all have them. We can all try and do better at different paces. So. And that will be an interesting place to come on to next is how you think about the future, and be interested to see whether you have a sort of optimistic or a pessimistic cast. I try and encourage people to take an optimistic cast here and say, look, if we could magically persuade more of the 8 billion people on the planet to have a more rational approach to all problems, but also more broadly compassionate ethics, what do you think that future might look like ultimately? And you can think sort of sci-fi distant future or more intermediate, and I'm very open to however you want to frame that, whether it's different forms of political system or the influence of your own work on the law. How do you see the future might play out?
Yeah, there's a cultural side to that and a legal side, and I've done a lot of thinking about this in my writing and just as a human being. As I've studied climate change, one thing that's really been more of an emphasis than I anticipated as a legal scholar is studying human nature and how we respond to problems.
Yeah.
So what I've really understood about climate change and why it's so difficult, because we've had other major transboundary environmental challenges in the past, like stratospheric ozone depletion. That was an existential threat, just like climate change. And yet we addressed that very effectively. And so I put a lot of thought into why did we do so well with addressing stratospheric ozone depletion, which is this global transboundary problem, and yet we're failing so miserably with climate change. And there were some pretty easy initial answers from a scholar's perspective, and that was economics. It was much cheaper for the global community to address a transition from chlorofluorocarbons to an ozone-friendly version of chlorofluorocarbons. That was only one small sector of the economy, whereas climate change affects all sectors.
Yeah,
and then there was a legal dimension to this as well, in that it's much more legally complex to regulate climate change because it affects all sectors, again, rather than just a tiny sector like stratospheric ozone depletion. And then there was the political dimension, in that the US was an ambitious leader of the effort in stratospheric ozone regulation, whereas the US has been one of the major impediments to effective climate regulation. So those are three very clear reasons why we see that disparity between the success of the ozone regime and the failure of the climate regime. But when I thought about it at a deeper level, it really comes down to more of a human nature problem, that we are very bad at addressing things that are slow onset and perceived as long-term threats. So if it's not an immediate threat to our life today, we are not likely going to address it effectively. And so that overrides.
It never quite gets to the top of the agenda.
Yeah, exactly. And short-termism, the economic needs always trump the ability to plan for the future more effectively. And there's this core principle of environmental law called the Precautionary Principle, which worked very well with ozone, in the sense that we didn't even see the ozone hole until after we already had a major international treaty in place to address it, because there might be an ozone hole in the future.
Yeah,
so that's the essence. That's the essence of the Precautionary Principle. You don't need to be bleeding to respond to address something that might cause bleeding later. So with climate change, we've done the absolute opposite. That all of our efforts to address climate change ultimately ran up against economic and cultural challenges that we weren't willing to be flexible and adapt to. And we just kept paying the price for postponing those needed long-term regulatory efforts that needed to happen now. So now we're in a position where climate change is an emergency. And I'm optimistic about that because humans are at their best when they're responding to something that is a perceived or real emergency. So if you look at the response to COVID, that's a huge human success. And climate change is every bit as palpable an immediate threat to us now as COVID. And we're starting to see that the news in 2020 reads like a dystopian science fiction work, I mean, wildfires and floods and droughts and major storms every day on the newspaper. So if we are now able to embrace climate change as the emergency that it is, I have a lot of hope that we're going to get it right. Our biggest failure was our inability to see a slow onset long-term challenge as something we needed to address now. So that's really kind of from a legal perspective. And I also think from just a personal moral perspective, I always have kind of a glasses half full perspective because I really see humans as fundamentally adaptive creatures. And we look at the course of human history, there will be winners and losers, and that's very unfortunate. And the way our world is now, this neoliberal reality that we face is that the rich are going to fare far better than the poor in this. But as a human race, we're going to get out of it and get to a better place. We're going to be forced into decisions we should have made 10, 20 years ago, but we're going to get through it. But the real tragedy of it is that it's going to be a grossly disproportionate scenario of winners and losers that didn't have to happen if we had acted 20, 30 years ago and could have taken the vast majority of humanity through this challenge.
And are there, assuming we do adapt and respond, we've let it get to such a crisis that we have no choice and we do then click into gear and address this sensibly, are there deeper changes that you think we might see in our society and our politics and human ethics more broadly that will position us for subsequent next threats? Or do you think we'll just fix this crisis, go back to normal and wait till the next crisis pops up?
And that's what I see us really moving into the future that way, that I don't ever see us returning fully to the status quo we were in before COVID and before climate change has escalated the way it has just in the past few years. So I think what the biggest change as humans that we will see, and this generation coming up of millennials and Gen Z, they have been raised with this ethic that we as humans have to be mindful of our impact on the earth, on non-humans, in every decision that we make. My generation, the baby boomers, were not raised to think that way. We were invincible exploiters and takers, and everything was going to be okay. So that fundamental flip of the switch in human mindset is going to have a big difference moving forward. And as the baby boomers die off and the millennials and Gen Zs are in charge, we are going to see a very different human interaction with nature, with non-humans generally. That is going to be good for the planet. But I also
so that's more of a generational cultural shift than people changing their minds. It's more waiting for people to die off and the new generation to come through.
In some sense, yeah. I mean, there is going to be this
unfortunately.
transition. I mean, it's kind of a cynical way of thinking, but it's true to some degree. I mean, if you look at the membership of Congress in the U.S., we're seeing many more millennials infiltrate Congress now, and that has really triggered an enhanced liberal dimension to what Congress is considering. Those efforts aren't getting passed yet because we still have too many baby boomers, old white men in Congress, but that's going to shift very quickly. And even some of the old white men are coming around to more kind of sustainable minded thinking on a lot of these things that they wouldn't have even 5 years ago. So, I mean, the fact that the Green New Deal is even being discussed is a big step for the US. I mean, that just would have been laughed out and discarded 10, 20 years ago. So the fact that there is this idea of sustainable development out there that has been largely lip service for the past 20, 30 years since it's been established, that we need to think about long-term considerations when we act now, but we're just going to go ahead and act anyway. That is now starting to change to more of a legal mandate, that ultimately we're seeing courts and legislatures thinking in a way that if something being proposed is unsustainable, it's not going to happen. And that's really the key to our future in living in harmony with what's left of the planet, is that sustainable development notion has to be a mandate and not just an aspiration.
Yeah, and it always feels too slow when you're in and trying to drive this type of social change, but it's real. I mean, that, it genuinely is. You don't have to go back many years or many decades to feel a very different tone, even in politics when we're talking about these issues. Things that were on the fringe are now mainstream. So we just need to keep pushing faster and harder.
Yeah, and I've been very encouraged by some very ahead of their time thinking among jurists in the U.S. and even more so outside the U.S. That there's just been this leadership role that courts have adopted on these issues that are starting to drive a social and political agenda for lawmaking, and that's not really the way it's supposed to work. The lawmaking is supposed to come from the legislative bodies, but when the legislative bodies are stuck in neutral, the courts have a very important role to play about introducing ways of thinking about issues that can ultimately be embraced by the legislatures. And so it's created some short-term chaos in different decisions from different courts on very ambitious things that may or may not stick, but it's created an important dialogue about how we need to have this shift toward more sustainable thinking and how we approach these issues.
And as an outsider, it seems that role of the legal profession and the courts themselves are playing is really quite an analytical one, of going back to basic principles that we're supposed to have already agreed and now just applying them. Whereas maybe the political system has sort of warped them and our social norms have taken us away from those. Sometimes the courts can go back to those principles and go, well, no, this is the situation, and that becomes a leadership role, really. And there are different schools of thought. Some people will think that social change happens and then the law follows on afterwards and codifies it, but I don't think that's always the case, is it? And you can see it also in the animal ethics field as well, with some really interesting work being done in the US and in India and in Switzerland around personhood, around more genuine, grounded appreciation for the moral salience of sentience and what that might mean.
And what's interesting is that the courts are in a position to kind of check the pulse of the public on these kinds of issues, and legal scholars have a role to play too. So for instance, back in the 1970s, there was a famous work called Should Trees Have Standing? And that was a legal scholar, Christopher Stone, in the US, and his thinking influenced a US Supreme Court case that only a dissenting judge at the US Supreme Court said, yes, actually nature should have its right to represent itself. But the actual decision in the case was, no, humans need to represent nature. Nature itself doesn't have rights. So that was back in the early 70s. And here we are 50 years later, and we're confronting the same challenges that the courts are now presenting back to the public and saying, I think we're ready now for this idea. It's taken 50 years, but now we're in a much different place. The planet is much more compromised and exploited. There's much more of an emergency that we need to embrace this rights-based thinking. Now is the time. Maybe those folks 50 years ago were just, the hippie tree huggers ahead of their time, but now maybe it's something that's much more mainstream and necessary. So it's an interesting dialogue that goes on between the courts and the public that way.
Yeah, I agree. And so that's and I share that sort of frustrated but optimistic view of how we'll engage with the environment and non-human sentient animals as well. And I think we'll hopefully look back on this period as a time when we yet again managed to achieve some pretty radical positive social change, despite the fact it feels frustrating trying to make it happen. But I'm interested in your thoughts about what those shifts might mean for human ethics and politics and morality as well. How do you think it might shift the way we're organized, the way we think, and the way we treat each other, even within the human species? How do you see that evolving and developing?
Well, one encouraging development from COVID that I've seen is evolving into this philosophy or principle is this notion of one health, that we should no longer be thinking of human health as separate from non-human health. So the health of the planet, the health of non-human animals, and the health of humans, we're all this interconnected one health objective that we always need to be thinking about in this interconnected way in moving forward and for life on the planet. And so I think that's one very positive outcome that I think is going to shift the political discourse and the moral discourse, that it's just going to break down some of those speciesist barriers that we had before, that caused so much of this exploitation of non-humans, was that we weren't thinking in a one health sort of way. And a public health crisis like COVID forces us to think that way, even if we don't like to.
Yeah.
So I see that as one positive development. And then so much awareness about animal sentientism, whether it be this in the legal or non-legal realm, efforts like the cases that PETA brought, the case against SeaWorld to free Tilikum from his captivity in this tiny concrete bathtub, or whether it be the monkey selfie case that PETA brought, where it was an effort to get intellectual property rights to a monkey that had taken a photo in Indonesian rainforest. All of these efforts are reminders to us that, and the scholarly work in the field, which has been remarkable, just animal sentience science has evolved dramatically. I read a fantastic book called What a Fish Knows, and just the world of fish that were always considered so most exploitable among our food choices. You wouldn't think about worrying about the sentience of a fish if you're trying to make a moral decision about what to eat, where you'd be much more inclined to think about the moral value of a cow or a pig. The science is just remarkable, and then recent documentaries like My Octopus Teacher, just showing how there's this emotional world, so much like humans, and these cases involving chimpanzees and elephants brought by the Non-Human Rights Project. We're seeing so much of this continuum between humans and non-humans, much more so than I ever saw in my upbringing. And even as a young father, I never thought there was something morally wrong about taking my son to the circus or to a marine park. And now it's just, how could I have done that? It's just more awareness.
And that's part of the reason I quite like the idea of linking naturalism and the moral circle concepts together, because some people prefer to keep them completely separate. They say, here's my epistemology, here's my moral system, never the twain shall meet. There's, lots of people talk about the is-ought boundary, but I really like the idea that granting moral consideration based on sentience, and broader if you want to go that way, can be grounded in a naturalistic understanding of what it means to be a sentient being. And as you say, the science on that is developing all the time, and it remains uncertain, and we may never know all of the answers, but we certainly know enough to appreciate that those somewhat arbitrary boundaries that we've drawn in self-serving ways between species or different types of being are just eroded by our naturalistic understanding all the time, the more we understand. And one of the other challenges to that broadening of the moral circle, environmental or non-human animals, is that some people will say, look, we need to be prioritizing and focusing on the significant problems we have still within human ethics as well, in terms of discrimination and inequality. My simplistic view is actually addressing the environmental challenges and broadening our moral circle actually has positive benefits for the way we consider human ethics and as well. But some people do think it's more of a trade-off and a choice we have to make. It would be interesting to know, as we wrap up, what's your response to that challenge? Humans are the most important. Let's focus on the substantial problems we still have facing us.
So I hear that quite a bit, and it's something that I've embraced much more fully lately. That I don't see it that way at all. I see it as much more of an integrated challenge across humans and non-humans. And the reason why, really, since the Green New Deal was proposed, I've become much more aware of climate change as being very much a problem that reflects the failures of capitalism. So when we think about these other challenges we faced about inequalities among humans, that's really part and parcel of the challenges we're facing with the fate of the planet and human non-human relations. It's all interconnected. It's this idea that anything that is anthropocentric in nature or superiority in nature, whether it be man over woman or whites over minorities or humans over the planet or animals, all of those are interconnected challenges that we face as humans. And so there's no reason to say that protecting the immediate short-term economic or human-focused challenges must come first, because that's ignoring everything else that's part of the problem, and it's treating the symptoms rather than the disease. And so what I found so compelling about the Green New Deal was that it really goes to the root cause for the first time. It goes to the ills of capitalistic thinking and how that is driving climate change, and how we need to address racial and gender and social inequalities when we're addressing a problem like climate change. It's all part of the same picture. In our food system. It's all there. There's nothing left out. It's not about taking one problem at a time.
It all connects. And is your view on the economic and political side that we can, if you like, reinvent capitalism so it's more compassionate, it has more ethics built into it, but retains, I guess, the freedom that people value within capitalism? Or is your sense that we need a completely different system, a more radical alternative? What's your sense on that?
It's really more the latter, I'm afraid, and that alienates some of my colleagues. That I think at a minimum, I'm a social democrat. In many ways, some have already labeled me an eco-Marxist, and those to me are just labels. I just see it as a necessary transition of, if we're going to sustain ourselves as a society and as inhabitants of the planet, there needs to be a different way of engaging politically and culturally that departs from where we've been. Just like hunters and gatherers were different from the agricultural revolution and they were different from the industrial revolution, this is the next stage, and it's going to involve a political and cultural transformation because it has to.
Yeah. And one of the fascinating things about developing this sort of nascent community, global community around sentientism, is the sheer range of political views that people who take this approach have. So there's a common naturalism, of course, there's a common universal compassion, but that can lead people in very different ways. So there are people who call themselves sentientists who are, communists or socialists or Marxists or anarchists or boring centrists, or, they're all socially liberal almost by definition, because it's hard not to be if you have universal compassion. But on the economic and political spectrum, they support all sorts of different economic theories or political organization theories as well, which has been fascinating. And I quite like that neutrality about it, because I think as long as people are grounded in that naturalism and that universal compassion, we should have a radically diverse range of different ideas battling it out to work out what's the best way forward. But one of the challenges I think that I'm sure you've heard is that if you do move more towards a socialistic approach, there can be a tendency for authoritarianism to creep in that seems to then chip away at the compassion. And what's your view about how we could move towards a system of that sort without the dangers of authoritarianism or non-compassionate control?
Well, to be quite blunt, we need more women leaders. When you look at history, you're much more likely to see authoritarianism among matriarchy societies as opposed to patriarchy. And I think we're seeing that manifest itself already with many more women in highest political leadership position. They are doing far better on climate change. They're doing far better on social policies. And that might be a slight overstatement and not a slight of men's ability to be good leaders. But I was really more awakened to this idea in my course this semester, where one of my students did a paper on the connection between toxic masculinity and climate change, and the parallels are really quite striking. And another student did a study on women leaders in climate change, and it was also quite remarkable how gendered a lot of this challenge that we face is in terms of moving toward a more just society. And it's something that I see a lot of hope for. I see a big transformation in the U.S. of more women and minority representation in positions of leadership, and I'm seeing very positive, socially minded, justice-oriented, compassion for the planet kind of policies now than I did when I was growing up.
Yeah, the change is happening and it's real. And I think there's a fascinating interplay there between the choice of a political system or a political theory or an economic theory and the values of the people in that system. Because I think, a wide variety of different political systems might deliver good outcomes if the values of the people in it are universally compassionate and grounded in a naturalistic way of thinking. And almost any form of political or economic system or theory can cause enormous damage if the values of the people in it, running it, leading it, don't have that grounding. So I think there's a fascinating interplay there about, our ethics and our values and the political systems that we use to, represent those, but also to then act in the world. So
absolutely true.
Well, Randall, it's been a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much. And I think that's a nice note to end on, that, regardless of our political views about how to take the world forward, if we can upgrade human values to be more universally compassionate and to be naturalistic in the way we apply rationality to our thinking, I think we can make positive change happen very quickly. And, these conversations are a tiny little contribution, hopefully, to helping shift people's values in a positive way. So thank you so much for making the time to join me today.
I really enjoyed it, Jamie. I had a great conversation here, and I really applaud the work you're doing on bringing these issues to light. And yeah, it is about having conversations. I mean, the change won't happen without the dialogue first. So it's a great service you're doing, and wish you the best in moving it forward. And I'm eager to remain a part of it in any way I can. So the work I'm doing is very much aligned with what your program is seeking to do. And I will be giving another talk hosted by the UK Center for Animal Law, where we first heard me speak. So that's going to be an opportunity to hear about my latest article, which is about seeking to take down the fossil fuel industry and the industrial animal agriculture industry in a way that promotes that just transition as soon as we can through legal and other cultural mechanisms.
I look forward to it. Yeah, enormously valuable. Thank you. And what's the best way of people following you or learning more about your work and finding your books?
Well, my books are most readily available on Amazon. So just typing in my name to Amazon, you'll see the two most recent books that are most relevant for this discussion, and that is Climate Change and the Voiceless and What Can Animal Law Learn from Environmental Law, which was just released in its second edition this year. Climate Change and the Voiceless came out in its first edition last year. And I have a page on academia for those in the academic circles, with all of my articles available there, as well as Google Scholar. They're also accessible there. So I've got about 30 articles and chapters and 6 books.
That's great stuff. Enormously valuable work. Thank you so much. So it's been great to talk to you, Randall. Take care. Enjoy the rest of your day, and I look forward to your next talk.
Thank you so much, Jamie. Be well.